I had a neighbor that lived up the street. We were friends, and she broke her hip, and she went to the hospital, and when she was ready to be discharged to come home, a social worker inspected her home, and it was not safe. So she hired this lady, this Janet. She was an organizational specialist, and she came to clean her house so that she could return to her home.
My grandmother went up to help that person clear out the house so her friend could come home. The person who owned that organization company started showing up at my grandmother's house and befriended her. And so over a period of about a year and a half, this person became a regular person in my grandmother's life.
I was really surprised because we had very little in common, but she kept coming, and we became friends. And I was interested in her kids and her activities, and she asked a lot of questions about me, and in getting acquainted with people, especially friends, you tell them a lot of things about your life. So she had a good idea about my financial situation.
I think that with my mother dying, being terminally ill, this was a very difficult time in my grandmother's life. This was the most vulnerable she'd probably ever been in her life, to watch her child die of breast cancer that had spread to her brain. My mother had had a massive stroke that took out 1/5 of her whole brain. I think that as her daughter and as her mother, that this was a very difficult process for both of us. This person put herself in my grandmother's life and tried to fill that role of being a daughter. She was that person my grandmother could count on if she needed help doing something at the house. She was that person who asked how she was and how she was doing, and really showed an interest, which we now know was really grooming behavior, but showed an interest in my grandmother's life. Filled a void that had been taken away with my mother's illness and subsequent death.
She was just very helpful to me. And I guess I was maybe a little lonely because my other grandkids were, I didn't see them all the time. They're young, living their lives and working and that kind of thing. And I guess she just filled maybe an emotional gap. And I accepted it that way.
She would bring her children to my grandmother's house. She had her daughter come and bake cookies, or her daughter would come to show my grandmother how to do different things on the computer. She involved her children in creating this false relationship. And my grandmother, as I have said, was like a second mother to me. She helped to raise me. She would take in any kids who needed somewhere to go or needed love if they didn't get love in other places. So I think Janet knew that and used her children as a pawn to gain my grandmother's trust.
I began to feel that like she was part of my family. And that was the reason I kept giving her money. And she had the 2 kids. And I felt that I was helping them. So that was the main reason I kept giving her money. But she would tell me she was in a car accident, and she was waiting for a settlement, but she hadn't been released from the doctor, so she wouldn't get a settlement until he was through with her treatment. And she did that twice. She would call me, and she'd be in tears, saying that she didn't have the money for this or that, whatever it was at the time. And I fell for it, because I cared for her.
She requested money several times. I believe there were 15 to 20 different checks that were written as loans to Janet from my grandmother. Some of those checks were for a couple $100s, all the way up to checks for $50,000.
She said she would pay me back. She was always going to pay me back.
This person became the power of attorney, medical power of attorney, and executor of my grandmother's will.
I trusted her. I certainly wouldn't have done everything I did if I didn't trust her. Because I felt if it were a member of my family, I would have done the same thing. She kept promising. She had worked for a cosmetic company where she went to homes and took orders and then ordered the product that the people wanted. So she said that that company was selling the company and that they were having lots of meetings with the people that are going to be buying the company. And it was taking a long time for this to happen. And she had told me that it was going to be settled in October, I believe. And so I was sure I was going to have the cash. So I had a new roof put on. I needed it. And when I had talked to her and found out that that hadn't happened, I was stuck with that huge bill, and my credit cards were already maxed. Because of her, I didn't have any credit debt until her. But that left me just completely devastated. What was I going to do? Because I eventually had to finance it. But that's when I realized that I had really, really been taken. Why was I so stupid that I could not see what she was doing to me? And so November and December, I kept it to myself. And January, I couldn't hold it anymore. So I told my granddaughter and her husband. And they immediately started finding out what we had to do. And they both went through the process with me.
My grandmother was really upset. I think it was probably one of the most difficult things she ever had to do was to tell us about this crime that had been committed. She didn't know what to do. She had been convinced to take out a reverse mortgage on her home. She had taken money out of her savings, out of her checking account. She had taken money, cash withdrawals off of her credit cards in order to loan Janet this money that Janet was going to pay her back. So when she told us that, we immediately went to her bank statements that had copies of the checks on the back and began adding up how many checks were written to this person. And we came up at that time with a total of $186,000. That night, we just went home. It was overwhelming. We couldn't even contemplate that she had access to that kind of money. My grandmother's not a wealthy person. We took that night to think about, what do we do? What is this? What happened? Is it really that much money? So the next day, I called the police and made a police report. Janet was charged with, I believe, 10 counts of felony theft by deception with major economic effect. The prosecutor did a wonderful job of meeting with us, answering any questions that we had. We were able to call her or email her or set up meetings to go and talk to her in person, but it was still an overwhelming situation that we had never been through before.
What we were needing to prove was that Janet was lying about the purpose for the money that she was asking for, and also it was our belief that she was lying about her intent to repay Mariana. So what we had to show was what Janet's financial situation was like, what she was spending that money actually on, and whether she really did have any potential for repaying Mariana.
There were a number of different search warrants done to banks to track where the money went from Mariana. After she had written a check, for example, we traced where that went, to what bank was it deposited, and then where was that money then spent. A large part of the case was to show or prove that the money was spent on something that the suspect in this case said she was going to spend it on. We had to show that she was not, in fact, spending the money on that, to show the deceit. And luckily, Amy, Mariana's granddaughter, was extremely helpful. And if I needed statements from a bank that Mariana had kept, Mariana could go and she would pick them up for me at Mariana's residence and bring them to me. And I could then have that for my case.
The other thing we do in these cases is we have the luxury of having a financial analyst who works in our office. And she's this brilliant woman who takes all of these financial records and then creates Excel spreadsheets from them, and then creates what they call pivot tables, which are summaries of relevant transactions. And from those records, Becky Tyrell was able to create tables showing exactly what Janet had spent, Mariana's checks for. And sometimes it was trips to the Washington coast or some other places. So we had Mariana testify, and we had the financial records that we got in through Mariana. But then primarily we had that financial evidence proven or testified to by Becky Tyrell. So she was our last witness, and my colleague Amanda Froh, who co-tried the case with me, questioned her about all of the spending that she saw and how the money that Janet got from Mariana was spent. And so Becky really told the story again from the perspective of these financial records, which are really incontrovertible. So she really, there's nothing to challenge about that. It's right there in black and white in these records that the jury has in front of them. So it's beautiful evidence that corroborates the victim's experience very well.
There were over a year of delays in actually getting to trial because Janet had changed lawyers or requested that the date be pushed out. So we had several actual trial dates before we actually went to trial. We were really anxious just to get it over with and be done. I should say that we're not a family that has regular interactions with law enforcement or the justice system, so it was very new to us to go through that process, and it was exhausting to go through that process.
For this case, it took almost 2 years for it to go to trial from the time that it was reported to the police. And for us and for the court system, that may not seem like a very long time in the grand scheme of things, but for a victim, that's a very long time. And to go over what's going on multiple times with the patrol officer, with the detective, with a prosecutor, it can seem just very redundant. And understanding that the victim is going to have frustrations, as any reasonable person should have.
It was emotional. It was stressful. It was terrible.
Understanding their frustration and also ours as far as the search warrants and the documentation and the thousands of pages of bank stuff you're getting back. At the end, it all came together, but it did take time, and it took a team of us working together.
We persisted, and we went to trial, and we got a guilty conviction, and she went to prison. But in addition to that, we've done a lot of advocacy work on this topic. Anytime that I was interviewed or I was asked to give a speech or go lobby at our state capitol, I called my grandmother first. And I said, Grandma, is it okay if I go do this? Are you okay with this? Because it is a situation that has some embarrassment and shame and humiliation associated with it. But my grandmother is so strong. She never said no. So one thing that this has done is it's definitely brought us closer. We went through the trial, the depositions, the stress of having to go to court. And I think in the end, to me, what's the most important is that I think that we're closer than we've ever been, that we talk to each other and we laugh and we are not defined by this crime.
I wanted to move on with my life and not carry that with me. I can't undo it, so I'm just going to live my life.